Immanuel Kant's Transcendental Philosophy, How Always Already is Sublime Poetry. Prologue. The etymology of always shows it comes from the Old English all the way, a temporal sense of continuing indeterminately, and the etymology of already combines all and ready with the spatial sense of all is prepared, all is fully ready. Always touches the moment indeterminately, and already grounds the moment as ready. I first encountered the words always already translated from the German immer schon in the writings of Martin Heidegger. These two words captured my imagination, and while reading Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, I wondered, do these two words form a synthetic a priori judgment? In Martin Heidegger's Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, he tells us Kant's synthetic judgments, then, are synthetic in a twofold sense. First, as judgments in general, and second, insofar as the legitimacy of the connection or synthesis of the representation is brought forth from the being itself with which the judgment is concerned. The poetic sublimity of the words always already bring forth a connected synthetic representation of judgment as a transcendental idea. Kant develops the synthetic a priori in the Critique of Pure Reason, and I wondered, how can an a priori concept become synthetic? Synthetic a priori propositions, as Kant presents, add to the concept of the subject a predicate that was not thought in it at all and could not have been extracted from it through any analysis. The predicate that is added is not derived from experience as relates to the subject. The necessity inherent in the addition is a priori in the sense of amplification, creating a new synthesized cognition of understanding. It is transcendental reason as a totality that synthesizes cognitions as an a priori possibility. In Kant's Opus Posthumum, he explains, the consciousness of myself in the formula I am is identical with the proposition I am an object to myself, an object indeed of inner intuition and of the thought of the determination of that which I ascribe to myself. The I as an object to myself is given to itself by the subjective appearance a priori in intuition. Kant explains, the proposition I am to myself an object of the intuition and thought of the manifold of the intuition of myself is a synthetic a priori proposition into whose possibility I may not inquire. It is the twofold forms of intuition, space and time, the intuitions of the inner and outer, that comprise the manifold of intuition. Kant posits the I as an object of the subjective intuition and hence a synthetic a priori possibility. The question arises, how is it possible that the proposition of the subjective intuition and the manifold of the intuition are beyond inquiry? Kant presents the argument. Space, time, and that which combines both intuitions, the outer and the inner in one, are not given things, as objects of perception, given independently outside the subject. They are mere forms of sensible representation which belong to the subject a priori and contain the general problem of transcendental philosophy. How are synthetic propositions a priori possible? Without the forms of intuition, of space and time as principles of the unity of the understanding, knowledge as experience would not be possible. Kant explains, these objects are here given only in appearance as subjective forms of intuition on which the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge is also founded. The possibility of synthetic a priori propositions as intuitions are presented but not experienced, although the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge creates a ground, a substrate for the possibility of these same propositions. Kant continues, the first act of knowledge is the verb I am self-consciousness, for I as subject am an object to myself. In this, however, there lies a relation which precedes all determination of the subject, namely, the relation of intuition to the concept, in which the I is taken doubly, that is, in a double meaning, insofar as I posit myself, that is, on the one hand, as thing in itself, and secondly, as object of intuition. To be precise, either objectively as appearance, or as constituting myself a priori into a thing, that is, a thing in itself. This statement describes Kant's Copernicus turn, which he writes, as in a manner contradictory to the senses, yet true, seeks for the observed in the observer. The transcendental I posits itself at once as a thing in itself and as an object of intuition, seeing itself inexhaustibly as a possibility in relation to the forms of space and time. This possibility arises from pure unconditional concepts and is necessary for the unity of reason. Kant explains this as the difference between appearance and thing in itself. Pure intuition, which under the designation of space and time contain merely the formal element of the composition of the manifold of intuition, and which thereby contain an a priori principle of the synthetic knowledge of the manifold, which, for this reason, represents the object in appearance. The synthetic a priori knowledge that is foundational for reason is twofold, but expresses the unity of the idea as subjective and objective, as thing in itself or noun, and as an intuitive appearance presented to us or verb. Kant explains, the difference of the manifold of intuition, whether it represents the object in appearance or according to that which it is in itself, signifies nothing other than whether the formal element is thought as merely subjectively valid, that is, for the subject, or objectively valid for everybody, which amounts to the question whether the position should express a noun or a verb. The activity of pure intuition presents sense objects as appearance relationally with the thing in itself. Objects are apprehended through intuition and therefore not as objects as themselves. This apperception is not perception. Kant states, the intuition of space with its three dimensions and that of time with its single one furnish synthetic a priori propositions as principles, but not for sense objects, for they are not apprehensible things which present themselves to intuition empirically, and their representation with consciousness is not perception. It is the unity of the manifold of apperception, the whole of intuition, synthesized a priori by the understanding that is in relation actively with the ideas of reason. Kant continues, just as little is the system of the aggregate of such presumed perceptions experience. Rather, it is a whole of intuition which objectively is merely appearance, to which the object as thing in itself is thought as corresponding merely in the idea. Synthetic a priori knowledge using pure intuition in space and time form representations simultaneously, which originate subjectively. Hence, the possibility of experience forms a necessary agreement with the conditions of possible experience. Thought created by the possibility of experience present the representations in space and time, which are not actual as a determinate reality. The representations are in this sense subjectively presented. Our representations, as Kant argues, are not produced by objects, but conform to the faculty of representations and its synthesis. This faculty of representations, the manifold of intuition as such, are presented through space and time synthetically as a whole. There is a seriousness inherent in the activity of the relationship of apprehension and understanding and reason. In the Opus Posthumum, Kant presents responsibility as a concept of right and duty. He explains, there is a concept of right in the relation of men among one another as principle of moral practical reason. The question arises, how does myself as a thing in itself assume responsibility for this concept of right? Inherent in Kant's words, principle of moral practical reason is an acknowledgement of responsibility as duty to myself. Kant explains, I am an object of myself and of my representations. That there is something else outside me is my own product. The presentation provided by the synthetic a priori is an active process, as Kant argues. We can represent nothing as combined or connected in the object without having previously combined it ourselves. This synthetic a priori forms the inner and outer selves through the conscious activity inherent in intuition. Kant further argues, I am conscious of myself. I think, that is, I am an object of understanding to myself, but I am also an object of the senses to myself and of empirical intuition. The I always already actively posits itself by actively presenting itself to itself through the forms of intuition of the understanding, and contains inherent in this activity a conscious responsibility. This relationship with reason, Kant argues, constitutes the formal element of synthetic a priori knowledge from concepts into a principle for itself. This principle for itself is a duty to oneself. Synthetic a priori knowledge is presupposed by the possibility of experience. Kant writes in the Critique of Practical Reason, pure reason can be practical, that is, can of itself, independently of anything empirical, determine the will, and it does so by a fact in which pure reason in us proves itself actually practical, namely autonomy in the principle of morality by which reason determines the will to deeds. Pure reason brings forth transcendental freedom and provides the conditions of the chain of causality with the necessary unconditioned causality that is altogether self-determining. Pure practical reason posits transcendental freedom as an a priori universal grounded on the idea that this is true for all rational beings. Kant writes, speculative reason was quite rightly denied anything positive for cognition beyond objects of experience, hence of things as noumena. Practical reason identifies the possibility and the necessity of the noumena, which brings forth the autonomous idea of freedom, which is not in contradiction with pure reason, but is, as Kant explains, to preserve against all objections the assumption of freedom, regarded negatively as quite compatible with those principles and limitations of pure theoretical reason, though without letting us cognize anything determinate and enlarging about such objects. Transcendental freedom independently orders objective reality as things in themselves, not as appearances. This is performed spontaneously by the will as the transcendental I and is grounded in moral law. The seriousness in Kant's moral law is the participation of our understanding with the good will, and therefore Kant argues, the moral law, even though it gives no such prospect, nevertheless provides a fact absolutely explicable from any data of the sensible world and from the whole compass of the theoretical use of reason, a fact that points to a pure world of the understanding, and indeed even determines it positively and lets us cognize something of it, namely a law. It is the autonomy of moral law, the freedom from the empirically derived laws of the sensible, that the supersensible arises, which is independent of empirical sense and belongs in relation to the autonomy of pure reason. What accompanies this law is a feeling of the sublime, Kant explains. The categorical imperative, which founds the incomprehensible system of human freedom, does not begin from freedom, but ends and completes with it. There is a certain sublime wistfulness in the feelings which accompany the sublimity of ideas of pure practical reason, and at the same time a humility which leads one to subordinate oneself to this object. There is a profound responsibility and reverent seriousness in this statement. The concept of the categorical imperative as moral law and the possibility of the concept of freedom, which arise through the categorical imperative, is regulative as a relational principle. Kant argues, it is utterly impossible to unite the principle of causal relations in the world with freedom, for that would be an effect without a cause. Reason, as will to deed, as purposive, is conditionally necessary. Sublimity occurs when the possibility of freedom synthesizes unconditionally with the moral law, the categorical command of the imperative duty. The regulative principle of the possibility of freedom exists in relation to the categorical imperative, and these are united and ordered and provide an a priori grounding that actively regulates the inherent causality of the moral law. Additionally, Kant states in his observations on the feeling of the beautiful and sublime, among moral qualities, true virtue alone is sublime. Moral law is directed towards and determinative of the highest good. The transcendental I, as itself, is responsible for the ordering of the will, as Kant argues that it is a duty for us to promote the highest good. Hence, there is in us not merely the warrant, but also the necessity, as a need connected with duty, to presuppose the possibility of this highest good. Therefore, this possibility is universally valid and a priori. It is the transcendental principle of the possibility of freedom that regulates the chain of causality inherent in the categorical imperative. Freedom is not a concept derived from causality, it spontaneously arises from causality, as Kant argues. These conditions, however, do not play any part in determining the will itself, but only in determining the effect and its consequences in the field of appearances. Our practical reason posits our obligation freely. Pure practical laws do not take intuition as its basis, but instead, Kant explains, pure practical laws take as their basis the concept of their existence in the intelligible world, namely the concept of freedom. In this sense, we posit freedom, for as Kant argues, were there no freedom, the moral law would not be encountered at all in ourselves. This does not mean that the concept of freedom is the basis or ground of the categorical imperative. The idea of freedom cannot exist separate from the categorical imperative. Reason would not realize freedom, as freedom is necessarily and actively connected to the moral law and cannot be known, cannot be realized, except in relation to the moral law. Kant states, the concept of freedom is not the basis on which the concepts of right and duty can be founded, but the reverse. Freedom as a necessity arises from reason to regulate the causal chain found in experience, and as a first cause acts transcendentally towards experience in its totality. Judgment acts as an intermediary between pure reason and practical reason. In Kant's critique of judgment, he poses the question, does judgment give the rule a priori to the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, the mediating link between the cognitive power in general and the power of desire? Kant begins his answer by stating that judgment is a cognitive power and lays claim to a priori principles. He continues and explains that although judgment's principles are not such that they can form a special part between theoretical and practical philosophy, but may be annexed to one or the other as needed. The key point here is as needed. Judgment actively, as an a priori principle, plays a unique role and therefore has its own unique source. Kant explains, judgment itself must provide a concept through which we do not actually cognize anything, but which only serves as a rule for the power of judgment itself. The transcendental judgment that Kant presents is reflective induction, but must necessarily presuppose and assume the possibility of the unity of experience, since otherwise our empirical cognition could not thoroughly cohere to form a whole of experience. This presupposition, as Kant argues, does nevertheless contain a law of governed unity, unfathomable, but still conceivable by us. Judgment's a priori contingency is towards the unity of the possible, drawing from the necessity of the understanding's coherence, and subjectively and actively in relation draws itself towards, in Kant's words, a principle of purposiveness. The combination of the two words, always already, present the theoretical and indeterminate simultaneously. Theoretical as an a priori concept known prior to experience, and indeterminate in its sublimity. There is a poetic sublimity in these two words that reflect Kant's definition of the sublime and beauty when he states, both presuppose that we make a judgment of reflection rather than either a judgment of sense or a logically determinative one. For Kant, aesthetic judgment creates a liking found inherent in the beautiful and the sublime, which does not depend on our understanding as sensation or as a practical concept found in our concept of the good. Rather, Kant argues, we do refer the liking to concepts, though it is indeterminate which concepts these are. There is an attunement to these indeterminate concepts, a purposive momentum that elevates the transcendental I within its reflective aesthetic judgment. This subjective reflection is the source of the sublime from which the sublime arises, springs forth from the spirit that animates. Kant tells us, spirit or Geist, in an aesthetic sense, is the animating principle in the mind, but what this principle uses to animate or quicken the soul, the material it employs for this, is what imparts to the mental powers a purposive momentum, i.e., imparts to them a play which is such that it sustains itself on its own and even strengthens the powers for such play. The purposiveness inherent in judgment is not freedom as such, as freedom found in relation to pure practical reason. What is at play here is the magnitude of the sublime that is relationally active with a supersensible cognition that supersedes our understanding and establishes its own causal substrate. Kant states, the supersensible is unconditionally cognized a priori with its own causality. At the same time, judgment is purposive towards coherence. It also already actively brings forth the supersensible, mediating between freedom found in the practical moral law and our theoretical conception of the world. Kant argues this premise. There is in man an active but supersensible principle which, independently of nature and the causality of the world, determines nature's appearances and is called freedom. The attunement afforded by judgment with an active supersensible freedom does stretch our imagination. How is it possible that judgment presupposes unity and contains its own subjective causality? And how does this necessarily interact with pure and practical reason? Kant argues it is the supersensible principle as the aesthetic idea found in freedom that allows this necessary interaction. He states, now I maintain that this principle is nothing but the ability to exhibit aesthetic ideas, and by an aesthetic idea I mean a presentation of the imagination which prompts much thought, but to which no determinate thought whatsoever, i.e., no determinate concept, can be adequate. But how can an aesthetic idea have no determinate thought? The imagination plays with inner intuition and creates ideas that have no determinate concepts. It is the presentation of the imagination as ideas that create, unbounded by experience, something that surpasses nature. It is the unbounded quality of the imagination that apprehends indeterminate ideas as an animating principle and presents these as multiple presentations. Kant argues that it is our inability for words to communicate this experience, which is not a logical presentation, when he states, "No language can express it completely and allow us to grasp it." But how do we comprehend this animating principle? The key here appears to be the indeterminate quality of the animating principle and the use of our power of judgment. As a counterpart to the logical judgment, the aesthetic judgment calls upon reason as a reflection of the aesthetic. Reason, which requires unity, awakens and actively comprehends the aesthetic by means of expansion, an expansion that in and of itself is not logical. Kant states, "These aesthetic attributes yield an aesthetic idea which serves the mentioned rational idea as a substitute for a logical exhibition, but its proper function is to quicken the mind by opening up for it a view into an immense realm of kindred presentations." It is our inability to express this as a unified thought, as it stretches our imagination beyond the logical, that Kant argues is our attempt to express our thought as comprehensible with poetry. Poetry also takes the spirit that animates solely from the aesthetic attributes, attributes that accompany the logical ones and that give the imagination a momentum which makes it think more in response to these objects, though in an undeveloped way, than can be comprehended within one concept, and hence in one determinate linguistic expression. Poetry for Kant expresses aesthetically that which language through imagination struggles to construct, and within this process strives towards higher principles found in reason. Kant states, "In this process we feel our freedom from the law of association, and with this freedom, the poet," Kant argues, by means of an imagination that emulates the example of reason in reaching for a maximum, ventures to give sensible expression in a way that goes beyond the limits of experience. The sublime for Kant springs forth from the reflective aesthetic judgment, produced by the quickening of the mind and the momentum of the imagination. The sublime can appear as the formless, translated from the German as Unform. Kant argues, "We see from this at once that we express ourselves entirely incorrectly when we call this or that object of nature sublime, even though we may quite correctly call a great many natural objects beautiful. For how can we call something by a term of approval if we apprehend it as in itself contrapurposive? This contrapurposiveness is exhibited in the sublime as formless chaos. The magnitude of this subjective formlessness presented by the sublime does not follow the principle of purposiveness as such, as Kant states. Instead, all we are entitled to say is that the object is suitable for exhibiting a sublimity that can be found in the mind. For what is sublime, in the proper meaning of the term, cannot be contained in any sensible form, but concerns only ideas of reason, which, though they cannot be exhibited adequately, are aroused and called to mind by this very inadequacy, which can be exhibited in sensibility. The contrapurposive nature of the sublime distinguishes itself from reason, and uses aesthetic judgment to reflectively connect to reason's idea of unity, and therefore creates a feeling of purposiveness. For Kant, the sublime and the beautiful as such are not at odds with each other. He argues, the beautiful and the sublime are similar in some respects. We like both for their own sake, and both presuppose that we make a judgment or reflection rather than either a judgment of sense or a logically determinative one. With the sublime, the reflective nature of the aesthetic judgment opens and expands the imagination as an attempt to equal the adequacy of reason, and the aesthetic judgment does this, Kant writes, without having a determinate concept from reason. The aesthetic judgment presents the sublime unformed subjectively in its purposiveness because, as Kant argues, precisely because objectively the imagination, in its greatest expansion, is inadequate to reason. Kant continues to explain that the sublime is a feeling that the imagination by its own action is depriving itself of its freedom in being determined purposively according to a law different from that of its empirical use. The contradiction of this action is precisely what makes the sublime the sublime. The magnitude of this sublime presents itself to us as an idea that is beyond our imagination. Kant explains, the imagination thereby acquires an expansion and a might that surpasses the one it sacrifices, but the basis of this might is concealed from it. Instead, the imagination feels the sacrifice or deprivation, and at the same time the cause to which it is being subjugated. The inability of our imagination through our understanding to comprehend as a totality the magnitude of the sublime as given to us by reason creates something akin to pleasure. When it is sensed that the imagination can no longer rise to the level of comprehension, Kant writes, imagination is inadequate for exhibiting the idea of a whole in which imagination reaches its maximum, and as it strives to expand that maximum, it sinks back into itself, but consequently comes to feel a liking that amounts to an emotion. The beautiful and the sublime are both presupposed by the reflective judgment, but as Kant writes in Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime, those in whom both feelings are united will find that they are more powerfully moved by the sublime than by the beautiful. The idea contained within always already is a necessary, unconditioned inference of reason. This idea is a synthetic a priori form of knowledge and is sublime poetry. The sublime presentation is active and relates to Kant's verb as subjectively valid as in synthetic knowledge, and the poetic contained in these two words exemplifies the sublime as expressing the magnitude of its premise that stretches our imagination. There is a sublime wistfulness inherent in these words, similar to the moral law as Kant argues, and there is a freedom associated with this as our imagination, in a poetic sense, imagines these words. It is the poetic for Kant that holds the highest esteem in the arts. He writes, it expands the mind, for it sets the imagination free, and so poetry rises aesthetically to ideas. The words always already contain both the beautiful and the sublime as sublime poetry, and in this sense, they capture the imagination. In the words of Kant, however, when these are both present, the sublime is more powerful than the beautiful. Thank you.